Welcome, everyone, to Your Vision, Your Vote, a program of Delaware's 2020 Millennial Summit. I'm Ralph Begleiter, your host for this third in a series of election-related programs on Monday nights this month. Thanks to the Millennial Summit organization and to Delaware's Spur Impact for hosting these programs, and thank you for joining us again tonight. Elections in the U.S. are always marked by public opinion polling, by political conventions, speeches, televised debates, door-to-door campaigning, and candidate rallies. But all those elements of election campaigns are influenced by the way the media cover them. Making sense of the media in the 2020 election is an unusually challenging task because the media themselves are changing, but also because the raging coronavirus pandemic has changed the way campaign events are held and the way they're covered by the media. And also because this is the first presidential campaign when the White House itself is characterizing most of the media as fake. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Peter Hamby, who is the head of news for Snapchat and the host of Snapchat's popular political documentary called Good Luck America. He's also a contributing political writer for Vanity Fair and a former CNN political correspondent. We'll try to help you make sense of the media in this election year, and we very much welcome your comments and questions. Please send them to us in the chat on the side of your screen. But before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that democracy is not a spectator sport, and there is a way you can get involved in nonpartisan politics if you want. If you've voted in the past, you surely noticed that American election polling places have been staffed by a lot of retirees, people like me who have more time available for public service and who have a demonstrated record of interest in politics. They sign people in at polling places, they check identification, run the election booths and machines, and channel results to public officials. Now, because COVID-19 threatens the lives of seniors, especially those with other underlying health conditions, elections officials everywhere, including here in Delaware, think many seniors will choose to stay away from the polls this year to protect themselves and others from infection. Now, even though election officials think many people will vote by mail in Delaware, polling places will need more than 4,000 volunteer poll workers. They'll still be open during the pandemic for those who choose to vote in person. So the Delaware Office of Elections is right now hiring paid political poll workers to help assure that everyone who wants to vote can do so. Now, you can do this, and I encourage you to do so. It's a great way to engage in public service while supporting democracy and learning about the voting process. To learn more, visit the website showing on your screen. To volunteer for these paid election jobs, you must be registered to vote in Delaware. You must attend just one training session, and they're available evenings and weekends if that's best for you. And of course, you must work on election day itself. Poll workers are needed for both Delaware's primary election on September 15th and for the general election on November 3rd. Most poll workers are paid $190 for their service. Some positions pay more. You can find out more at the Delaware Elections website on your screen. And please do your part to support elections in Delaware, because democracy is not a spectator sport. Now, let's get down to our conversation with Peter Hamby of Snapchat. Don't forget to post your questions in the chat, and we'll try to address them. Welcome, Peter. It's great to have you on the program this evening, and there's a lot to talk about. I feel like we have to start at least with making a transition from what people refer to as the legacy media to what people still refer to as new media, even though it's not all that new anymore. So let's take a look for just a second at legacy media. And I just want to remind people that there's a huge decline in radio listenership and newspaper readership. And that's, of course, been driven by technology, the shift from to digital, from analog kinds of presentations. It's been affected by a media shift to opinion from what you and I used to call straight journalism or straight reporting. And it's driven by suspicion of bias that is in turn fueled by political accusations of fakery. And so you're not finding as many people engaged in radio listening. You're not finding as many reading newspapers, even digital versions of newspapers. Television is kind of an exception, however, to this whole mess, and maybe we'll come back to it later when we talk about election campaigns, it is still the case today that more people get news about politics from television than they get from any other source. That is definitely changing, and you, Peter, are an example of the changes. Let's talk for a minute about the big social media brands. Facebook, the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, in the room. And Peter, did you notice this week the new reporting about the number of tweets and Facebook posts by members of Congress? Members of Congress certainly have taken to heart the idea that they've got to use social media, not just television, not radio, not newspaper ads, not newspaper editorials. I don't know if you saw this, but I thought it was kind of interesting, the sheer number of tweets per month. It looks like on Twitter, Democrats are tweeting 130 times a month. That's 4 times a day they're tweeting on social media. And on Facebook, 55 tweets from Democrats and 44 from Republicans. Does it surprise you at all that Dems are using the social media more than Republicans are?
Look, I think in some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. Before Donald Trump came along, Democrats were sort of heralded for embracing new media, social media, digital for, targeting, but also influencing the media. And I think what you're seeing here as it relates to Twitter and Facebook is Twitter is an amazing way to influence opinion elites, journalists like myself and you, people who are highly engaged, activists, etc. Twitter also skews slightly to the left in terms of its, self-identified user base. And I think I read a stat that came out last year that something like 10% of people generating political content on Twitter are journalists and sort of beltway type people. So as we've seen with Donald Trump over the last 4 years, but also 10 years, he was an early adapter of Twitter. It's a very powerful way. It's the new assignment editor, the new assignment desk in these newsrooms. It's piped directly into the eyes of every single journalist and decision maker at every news organization. At the same time, Twitter is vastly smaller than Facebook. A phrase that popped up and became popular during the Democratic primaries is Twitter is not real life, for the very reasons I suggested. I think only about a quarter of the actual American public has Twitter, and only a fraction of those people actually post to Twitter, whereas Facebook is used almost universally, not among younger demographics. Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, is more popular among millennials. But Facebook is a good way to stay in touch with actual voters and constituents versus Twitter, which is primarily a sort of, cocktail political chatter insider game.
And something else about these numbers that struck me was that even though Democrats tend to be posting more on Twitter and Facebook, it looks like the Republican audiences are reacting more. They're engaging more with those conversations in social media. On the right side of your screen, you can see that Republicans tend to click like or click favorite or retweet or share a post more than Democrats do. So at least among the Republican followers, I think you could draw the conclusion that these posts, these social media engagements, are more active with their base followers. Do you draw some?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that in the age of Trump, this might have been true before Trump, it might not have, but it's certainly true now. Trump has traffics in things that are designed to provoke emotion. And Democrats, plenty of Democratic digital operatives I've talked to understand that in politics, this is actually hurting them, right? Trump, because he constantly talks about emotionally charged topics like race, identity, immigration, and he's just willing to be provocative, generates content both from his official campaign in the White House, but also organically that is just more outrageous. Memes, things that are just about political combat. You see some of the similar type content on Fox News. It's existing on Facebook. That kind of content is naturally going to generate more clicks, more shares than a sort of anodyne post from a Democratic campaign about healthcare. So, I'm not, saying anything surprising here by suggesting that Trump era Republicans have tried to game emotion as a political weapon, whereas Democrats don't tend to think that way generally, and they've been slow to figure out how to respond. I've done some reporting for Vanity Fair about some Democratic consulting firms and some people working inside the Democratic Party who are trying to figure out how to create emotionally charged content of their own, sort of decentralizing messaging, giving it to influencers. But it's hard. I mean, I think Donald Trump is just more willing to play games with racism and xenophobia than Democrats are. And I think that generates more engagement, which is an unfortunate term there, but he does.
I would just wonder about these numbers, and I want to move on, but these numbers show engagement to the people who are posting. I sort of wonder if there was a way to measure whether Democrats were also engaging with the posts, but they were doing it on they were reacting on their Democratic channels, if you will, rather than reacting to the original poster. And so it might not just might not be showing up in these data. But it did strike me that, the members of Congress have 2,000 accounts, combining their campaign accounts and their official accounts and their personal accounts, and they're posting 100,000 posts a month in 2020. But the other thing on the bottom here is that it's a small number of members of Congress who are doing most of the talking on social media. 10% of the members get 75% of the audience reactions. And as you just said, and we don't really need to dwell on this, but you were pointing out the nature of the topics that the two parties are using on social media. And they did measure the kinds of words that are mentioned most frequently in posts by Democrats and mentioned most frequently in posts by Republicans. And you can see perhaps why there was more kind of reaction to the in the data anyway to the posts on the Republican social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always been the case, at least, going back to Goldwater, Nixon, that Republicans have found political success in finding emotionally charged, identity relevant topics to win elections. There was a famous book that came out after the 2004 election called "What's the Matter with Kansas," which belongs in the canon of, bewildered Democrats wondering what happened, how did we lose? The Republicans, got people to vote against their self-interest by focusing on guns and gay marriage and abortion. I mean, these are not new strategies. These go back to the Atwater days, but they are now sort of mutated and taken a life of their own on social media. And to what I was saying earlier, these platforms have given the tools to individual creators to make their own content. So, Donald Trump is the butterfly that flapped his wings, and then any Trump supporter in the world can make pro-Trump content with or without the blessing of the Republican National Committee and send it directly to their peers and their peer groups and their friends and their family. And those social connections are immensely more powerful than seeing an ad on television, than getting a piece of direct mail. That is the coin of the realm on the internet now, is what are your friends and peers talking about and what do they say? And even celebrities and influencers, they have more impact on how people think than sort of distant third parties in Washington sending them official communication.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your role in the social media. Let's talk about Snapchat and particularly your program, Good Luck America. You started this program when, 2015? 2014?
We launched at the very beginning of 2016, right before the Iowa caucuses last time. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me what I'm going to confess right away, and I'm sure I'm out of line with most of our audience, but I dropped my Snapchat account a couple of years ago. I dropped my Twitter account a couple of years ago. I gave up on that stuff. But tell me what prompted Snapchat to decide we've got to do political news. That, to me, that seems at the time seemed a little out of character, what I would have considered character for Snapchat.
Of course, yeah. And I think at the time when I left CNN to join Snapchat, a lot of people, including my colleagues at CNN, thought the same thing. I'm in Los Angeles now. The first time I flew out here in 2015 to meet with Snapchat's leadership team, I, like you, was skeptical of social media as a sort of vehicle for credible news and information. But it quickly became apparent in conversations with Evan Spiegel, a founder of Snapchat, and other people who worked here, that they thought about social media differently. For example, Twitter and Facebook, which you just mentioned, are broadcast platforms, right? One to many. And they live and die off of algorithms that, show you what you want to see and what they think you want to see. Snapchat, I'm trying to think of another example, like Netflix, curates a universe of content. So we work with credible publishers. We work with the Wall Street Journal and ESPN and BuzzFeed and the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they create content for Snapchat every day that reaches, tens of millions of people. Most of them, and this is an important reason why I went to work for Snapchat, are under the age of 34. And the majority of those are under the age of 25. That is a demo that is not subscribing to newspapers. They are not sitting down every night to watch the evening news, and they're not, even watching much TV anyway. But they are living on their mobile phones. In 2019, for the first time since this has been measured by marketing agencies, time spent on the mobile screen surpassed time spent watching television for all ages. And that's on steroids for people under the age of 25. So the combination of the fact that Snapchat expressed values around having real political content that could, influence young people, and also just news content generally, and entertainment content, versus the other platforms where anyone can publish. We don't have that. And because of that, in our content space, Discover, we don't have the same kind of disinformation, misinformation, fake news problems that the other platforms have. You'll notice when these platforms get hauled up before Congress to testify, there's one big platform that isn't getting called up there for these reasons, and it's ours. And Snapchat is almost twice as big as Twitter. It's a huge platform. We are pioneering how to think about news and content for the mobile screen, and I'm really proud of that. We just recognize the power we have in a certain generation, and with that power comes a lot of responsibility to be mindful and serious about the kind of content that appears on the platform.
I was reading about your show, Good Luck America, and it looks like you get 6 to 8 million viewers to your program. And we could argue, and we're not going to argue about whether a viewer is somebody who watches a whole show or not. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But reaching 6 million people at a shot is a very significant accomplishment. And the other thing I read was, as you have talked about, Snapchat generally reaching the, let's say, 20-somethings and 30-somethings. Your show in particular has a very high demographic in that age group. And so I would think that you have to approach, and I'd like to hear from you, how do you approach telling political news to an audience that in the past anyway,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly for a very long time, was not very engaged in politics and often didn't choose to even go and vote?
Yeah, and that's still an open question. Voter turnout in 2018 among voters between 18 and 30 was the highest it's been in almost a generation. But the promise of Bernie Sanders during the Democratic primary was that young people would flood the primaries and change the electorate. That didn't happen. So one, we want to encourage people to vote. Our partnerships team at Snapchat is highly engaged in making sure that people who use Snapchat, regardless of party, are figuring out ways to vote. Just today on Good Luck America, I have an episode up about the utter failure of the vote by mail system in New York State. It's been a month since the primary happened there. They sent out some 500,000 ballots, absentee ballots, to New York City, and they still haven't counted them because of postmark errors. They're understaffed. So I think for my show specifically, we're focusing a lot on knowing that the coronavirus pandemic is forcing a lot of counties and states to adjust to mail voting. how that's going to work, and letting people know how they can register to vote. But on the larger scale, yeah, I mean, 10 million people, for example, watched my show's coverage of election night 2018.
Wow.
And you can compare to television. It's little apples and oranges, like you mentioned, because a view of CNN is measured in a different way than someone who watches a minute of my Snapchat show. But that's a lot of people, right? I think 2 million people watched election night on CNN during the midterms. My singular approach has been to really take all of the lessons of my career, a lot of it at CNN, just to a different platform. There's a famous meme of Steve Buscemi showing up in a high school. I forget what show it's from, and he's holding a skateboard and he's dressed like a kid. And he says, "Hello, how do you do, fellow kids?" Like, I think a lot of programming designed for what we now refer to as Gen Z and previously millennials is sort of patronizing. They focus on what they think kids want to hear: legalizing marijuana, climate change. The reality is that, that demo cares a lot more, certainly, about issues of racial justice. As we've seen lately, they certainly care about climate change and view it as an existential challenge compared to older generations. But we don't just focus on niche issues for that generation. We cover everything. Tomorrow we're talking about Trump suggesting over the weekend that he wouldn't abide by the election results. Last week we covered a variety of topics in states and cities around the country. Like, the biggest thing that I do differently than I did at CNN is I just try to talk like a regular person. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but a big note I get from viewers of the show is, one, I trust you because, like, your experience. Like, I have a little bit of gray hair, which is not common on Snapchat, but I try to talk about politics like I would talk to my 20-something cousin or my 90-year-old grandma, because most people are not as engaged as the people on Twitter, the people who watch cable news constantly are. And that's been a benefit of working at Snapchat and even living in Los Angeles, which is its own kind of bubble. But Washington is a little self-obsessed and myopic and doesn't quite spend they don't spend enough time outside of DC. I know that's a timeless critique, but if you approach politics in a way that's very conversational and you have a voice that can be sort of funny and not be afraid to have a point of view on certain topics, I think people respect that. At least that's the feedback I've gotten. And then the other thing is to try to continue to be as unbiased is the wrong word, but fair as possible, because that generation certainly skews to the left. Doesn't mean they skew Democratic, but they skew to the left. They don't necessarily believe in political parties, but there are still tens of millions of people watching Snapchat who voted for Donald Trump or are going to vote for Donald Trump. And I think the idea of fairness is something that is kind of lost in the algorithmic universes of social media. And because we are a more curated experience and we have a high bar for entry in our content space, want to make sure that we're bringing credible and fair content to the audiences, regardless of their viewpoints. And a lot of people who watch the show have thanked me, and that's not to be self-aggrandizing, because they're like, "Oh, I didn't know there were kids who look like me who supported Donald Trump." Like, I've heard that from colleagues I work with and people who stop me on the street. And I think that's a great thing, that your Snapchat for a lot of this generation is their window into the world. And we are bringing them perspectives that they might not see in other media spaces, and certainly on social media.
Let's broaden out a little bit to include some of your competition. I want to talk for a minute about TikTok, which is the trendy, maybe, I don't know if it's trendier than Snapchat right now, but it's certainly pretty trendy among sort of the youngest end of the spectrum that you address. And I know you're not necessarily an expert about that, but could you envision TikTok becoming a platform on which people get news about politics that is useful news about politics?
It's hard to right now. Look, they have hired a American CEO, but they're still a company that's based in China. That House Democrats, Senate Republicans, the Democratic National Committee, the Pentagon have all told various people to take this off of their phones because it is a security risk. They have immense privacy issues. And as anyone who uses TikTok, including me, I scroll it. Their algorithm is extremely sophisticated. If you are cooking a roasted corn salad for dinner, 10 minutes later, you will see cooking videos about corn salad on TikTok. So as a space for political news, they are the one major platform in the world right now that isn't, based in the United States. And there are some concerns about that. One of them being currently they have a real problem with conspiracy theories. 75 over 90 million, I think, people were watching videos tagged with Pizzagate in the last month.
I was going to ask you about that, but go ahead.
Yeah, Pizzagate is, people watching this, I think, might know what that is. It flared in 2016. It's this theory that a lot of Democratic politicians and celebrities are involved in child sex trafficking. And more or less, the theory had been tamped down on other platforms like YouTube and Facebook or whatever. And it's resurfaced in a big way on TikTok. And it's not being managed in any way. And I did a story on it for my show and got a ton of tweets and DMs from TikTok users, apparently, who were saying I was making up lies, that Pizzagate does exist. Here is a platform pumping literal disinformation and conspiracy theories into tens of millions of American teenage brains every day. I mean,
so Peter, how does that happen? I mean, does that just mean that somebody can invent a new platform, call it TokTik tomorrow, and can revive any that's been debunked in the past, and that millions of young people will tune into it and say, golly, I hadn't seen that before? I mean, is there something wrong with that model?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to just invent a competitor platform, after one has sort of taken off. The thing that they have to do is figure out a way to manage it and be authoritative about doing it. At Snap, again, we approach this stuff with a different set of values. We thought that Snapchat was more of a platform where you communicate with your close friends and your family and your best friends, and the content should sort of reflect that sort of closed universe as opposed to a public-facing viral network, which these other things are. TikTok is like that. So it really comes down to, like all of these platforms, what are the leaders there going to do to manage or solve these problems? It's hard because TikTok, by the way, it's fun. I've had conversations with, and I wrote a piece about this for Vanity Fair, because there were a lot of concerns that Joe Biden is too old and, speaking of Delaware, hasn't been doing enough on social media and like to connect with the kids. And I talked to a lot of people up and down the Biden campaign who are like, what would Joe Biden do on TikTok? Right? It's like he is not in any way plug into that vernacular and that vocabulary. Biden, I interviewed him for my Snapchat show, and I asked him straight up, like, on TikTok, you are the subject of memes calling you old and lame and creepy. And, he said that, in typical politician speak, I am doing my best to communicate with young people. And he said, rightly, he's winning young people, so it might not even matter that much. Anyway, all of that is to say, it's hard for politicians and media companies to get on a platform and deliver serious information when you're competing with stuff that's very entertaining and fluffy. We've figured out a way to do it, I think. Some people are going to do it pretty well. And that brings to mind something else that maybe we can talk about later, which is one reason I went to Snapchat, and one reason that, I love podcasts, is that news organizations that have figured out ways to adapt to audience behavior are doing well. And I think that represents a lot of the future of how news organizations need to think about saving themselves in a very difficult business and consumer environment. And, if there's a news organization that can figure out how to translate news to TikTok, I mean, kudos to them. It's a challenge, and it's also going to involve the team at TikTok figuring out how to make it work while also removing some of these really terrible conspiracy theories that are flourishing there.
I just want to throw in the thought but we need to move on from TikTok, is that it's possible that the conspiracy theories that are reviving themselves on platforms like TikTok are ones that are being promoted by people who can't get them anymore on they can't manage to get them popped onto Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram or whatever, and so they turn to the next available one. And it's also possible, and I'm not making any accusations here, but we know that international players have become involved since 2016, 2015 in the US election process. And it's possible that the operators of TikTok see this as a way of influencing the 2020 presidential campaign. But I want to move on to our viewers were just seeing, and let's see it again here. Let's talk for just a minute about this event that occurred in the past week when the president and Ivanka Trump both were posing with cans of Goya beans and other Goya products on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook and so on. They literally staged photo opportunities for those things. Talk a little bit about how politicians themselves, and you led into this by talking about Biden being criticized for not being on TikTok, but here's the Trump campaign rewarding a campaign supporter by having Goya products on the resolution desk in the White House. Talk about that use of these social media platforms.
Yeah, I mean, well, a few thoughts. I don't know if I have a cohesive theory of the case on Goya at the moment, and I like Goya beans. I've been buying them a long time. One, putting aside the fact that they are likely violating federal regulations by using state accounts to promote a private product. I saw one tweet from, I think it was Alex Burns at the New York Times, who I like, he's a good reporter, who said of Trump's picture, like, imagine just wandering in off the street one day and seeing this picture and like wondering what that is. Like Trump, his strategy the whole time and currently is to really embrace a lot of the niche arguments and totems that are in his Republican base universe. A lot of people, if you just show them this picture on the street and said, what's going on here, would have no idea what's going on there. They would say that's President Trump posing with some Goya beans, but they would not be familiar with the back and forth over the guy from Goya being a Trump supporter. A lot, again, this goes back to the importance
of the Hispanic vote in the election coming up.
Yeah, these are very insular topics, and those, unfortunately, these are the foundations of the whole Twitter isn't real life argument. Since Twitter really took hold in the media in really 2009, 2010, a lot of the niche topics that bounce around Twitter end up conversation topics in the media. And, there's a lot of blind spots in the press, I think, because they spend too much time thinking about these, little flare-ups on the internet and not enough time out in the world talking to voters in both parties. So, it's another example of this that I can remember is from, I think it was 2019, last year. The head of Equinox, the owner of Equinox, who also owns SoulCycle, was revealed as being a big Trump donor. And, the customer base of Equinox and SoulCycle is extremely millennial, extremely urban, and henceforth really progressive. And I think it was Chrissy Teigen who started this boycott of Equinox and SoulCycle. She posted a tweet or an Instagram story saying she was going to boycott and everyone else should too. I'm sorry, like they might have lost some shareholder value in the short term, but I guarantee you everyone who was going to Equinox and SoulCycle before is still going to Equinox and SoulCycle. There's just a bit of virtue signaling going on both sides, where you can tweet something and people who are very engaged will engage with it, and then they'll forget about it in a week, and it never will have penetrated the the mind of the American electorate in any way. So that's I'm excited for stop thinking about Goya pretty soon.
Okay, now you have segued very nicely into by making reference to these business connections that you were just talking about. There's a whole business side to the digital media that we should just talk about for just a second as well. I just pulled together some statistics about the amount of advertising the percentage of dollars of advertising dollars that are going to digital media. And it will not surprise anybody, I think, to discover that Facebook is the gorilla in that room, with Google as a close second in terms of receiving advertising dollars. And everybody else in the game is relatively small potatoes. Now, the other category at the top of the chart here is large, but that's a whole bunch of other platforms, I presume, including Snapchat and TikTok and some of the others that you just mentioned as well. But the point is that advertisers who have to place their bets about where to reach various audiences are placing those bets with dollars with known, I'm going to say known commodities, like Google and Facebook especially. But I'm sorry, I hit that inadvertently. But the thing I think is worth talking about here is political advertising also going to, well, I did it again, sorry. Is political advertising also going to flow toward these digital platforms in the same manner, do you think, during this election year, as particularly now that we're getting into the final 2-3 months of the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, a few observations. One, like Google and Facebook, as you mentioned, sort of dominate the share of advertising generally. But it took a long time for them to get there and sort of build up the trust with advertisers and brands to put money into things other than television. And, they developed sophisticated ways to target their ads and then prove to people buying those ads that, hey, it works to do that on digital media. And Snapchat, is proving that right now, in part because we have, a young audience that can't be reached elsewhere. People think of Snapchat and Instagram as overlapping. I think like 35% or almost 50% of Snapchats, and again, I don't work on the sales side, I work in content. We have a nice church state separation over at Snap, which I am grateful for. But I think almost half of our audience can't be found on YouTube. Almost half of our audience can't be found on Instagram, and they're really young. And we are, finding ways to reach them. And like anything, it takes a long time to educate decision makers at ad agencies and brands that, hey, this is a worthwhile place to spend your money. But we started doing that in 2016, and the Trump campaign and the Clinton campaign both spent a lot of money on Snapchat. In the midterm elections, a bunch of campaigns statewide, congressional, spent money on Snapchat. Third party groups spent money on Snapchat. So we are absolutely part of that pie. One thing that's different about us, though, is that we, like the same way we have values around content, we have values around advertising. We are willing to take down ads that we determine are misleading. And we have standards around those things, and some other platforms do not. What you've seen also lately is a lot of advertisers are pulling their money out of Facebook and putting it elsewhere, because Facebook has, been playing whack-a-mole with a variety of problems for the last 4 or 5 years. Disinformation, hate speech circulating in private groups. And the real problem with Facebook is actually the stuff we were talking about earlier in the conversation. It's the organic stuff, right? That's where the hate speech might surface, for example, not in paid advertising. But, as perhaps as a fig leaf, a lot of companies are pulling their advertising budgets from Facebook in an effort, I think, to get them to change their, what are seen as negative behaviors. But right now, those two, Google, which includes YouTube, and Facebook, which includes Instagram, are the two behemoths in digital advertising. And still, the lion's share of political ads are going to television. So far this year, I think $250 million has already been spent by Trump and the Republican Party, and some $180 million has been spent by Democrats, and it's mostly going to broadcast and cable television. mostly cable news. I saw one document today from an ad buyer friend on the Republican side of things that showed a lot of that money is going to HGTV. So people are still like spending money on television, and digital is still second to that. But I think it's switching because, as I mentioned earlier, time spent on this is now where people are spending their time, not necessarily sitting in front of the TV. And it's also not either or. I mean, all of us sit in front of TV and watch Netflix and scroll our phones while we're doing it, watching Snapchat and TikTok and Twitter and Facebook and all those things.
Well, as you can see as our viewers can see on this chart, digital advertising is a tiny fraction of the overall dollars spent on television. And this chart is about local TV as distinct from national TV.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you want to explain why that's important? Why am I focusing on local TV as distinct from national TV?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, most Americans who say they get their news from television don't say they get it from Fox, CNN, or MSNBC. They get it from their local news. And one of my favorite things when I travel is to either be in a hotel room or when I'm visiting my parents in Richmond, who are watching right now, I believe, watch the local news because it's in part distinctive. It's extremely relevant to people's lives, right? I think a lot of national television news and a lot of the news you get on social media is actually fairly homogenous. What did Trump do today? What did Dr. Fauci say today? If I turn on the news in Richmond, I was home a few weeks ago and they were taking down the Confederate statues in Richmond, which is a big story. And it dominated the local news every night. That's something that wasn't really surfacing nationally. So, politicians also are spending a ton on local TV, and Joe Biden, even confined to his house in Delaware, I get his press alerts every day. They're doing TV hits in Raleigh and Charlotte and Wilmington and Columbus and Cleveland, Cincinnati. Like they realize that is the primary news source for most Americans who are watching television. One note though, when people tell Pew how they get their news, I do think there's a little bit of a response bias against social media. I think a lot of times people tell pollsters what they think they're supposed to say. That's a sort of commonly held belief among pollsters. And it's probably something you wouldn't admit to someone calling you, that you like to get your news from social media. Even as 35-40% of Americans say they get news primarily from social media, most of them say they don't trust social media. So it's sort of interesting. But local news is definitely the reigning champ of where people get it.
And if you look at this this chart of dollars political advertising dollars on local TV, you can see why local television stations salivate every 2 years when there's an election coming up, because their revenue doubles or sometimes triples during the years when there's an election, and they count on that. That's part of their financial planning as well. So it's a big part. We're really, I think, still at the transition point. And I'm sure that there is a transition occurring to social media. I don't have any doubt about that. But there's a lot of legacy money that is still getting thrown into the most local of political advertising forums, and that is local television.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and it's why the candidates, when they're campaigning, which may not be the case this year, but when they're campaigning, they get off the plane, and what do first? They do an interview with the local TV stations. They're not out to get on CBS or on NBC. They'll do their interview with the local TV channel because they like talking to that local TV anchor who is going to ask them all about the state they're in and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Oh, totally. That's exactly what happens. I've covered so many campaigns, and you land on the tarmac, and channel WRAC is waiting for you at the tarmac with their setup, and then the candidate hops in a motorcade and goes to his rally and does that separately.
I want to just pick up on a point you made a minute ago about the revenue switch to digital, and this just shows our viewers how dramatic it's been. I only could find data up to 2018, so it's a couple of years out of date, and I'm sure it's continued on this trend. But look at the impact. You could arguably say that the Donald Trump phenomenon in 2015, when he became a candidate for president of the United States, the impact was to shift revenue from other places to digital media and that has continued in a fairly dramatic way. Notice 2011 through 2014, it's pretty stable at around 17 to 21%. But after that, it's gone up from 21% up to 35% of revenue. That's a good thing for places like yours, Snapchat, for places like the major media like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal that have good digital platforms, because they're trying to move in a digital way. But 35% still is obviously only a third of their revenue, and the rest is still coming from more traditional sources of advertising.
Yeah, and like,
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, like, the original sin of digital media was giving it away for free, and by the time advertising started to wither, in print newspapers, people, the whole audiences realized, why do I need to pay for this? I've been getting it for free for 10 years. It's interesting looking at this chart though, Ralph, because when you talk about trust in media, no, it's fine. I think I remember it, but trust in media, Gallup measures this. I don't know how precise it is. Over the last 20 years, there have been 2 times there's been a precipitous drop in trust in media. One was in the run-up and aftermath of the Iraq War. Like, I think trusted media dropped like 10 points, like down to like the 20s or 30s, wherever it is now. And then when Trump was running for president, and part of that was him out there every day lashing the media, and the bottom sort of fell out with Republicans in terms of trust in media. But it did start to bounce back in 2017 and 2018, because a lot of consumers, 2015 and 2016 were like a ratings bonanza and a click bonanza, and Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, has apologized for putting Trump on television so much during that time. But when Trump became president, a lot of these news organizations, buckled up and started doing a ton of really muscular investigative reporting. And a lot of, the audience is highly engaged now, a lot of people, more so than maybe before Trump, about politics. And they started returning to these newspapers. I will say that the New York Times, which is in that app there, though, is like mostly pivoting to a subscription revenue model rather than an advertising model, and they are killing it. They are a brand and a news organization all at once, and they own their content from the daily to the documentaries they put on television. They're a production company, and it's an interesting model. They are a subscriber company, sort of beholden to their, liberal center-left subscriber base at this point, and they've been the subject of a lot of criticism lately from that very audience, because a lot of their audience members think they're supposed to be a anti-Trump resistance outfit, and the people that work at the New York Times are like, no, we do journalism. And I think that's an interesting dynamic of the subscriber model versus the previous model, which was, and like the Washington Post is obviously benefiting from a billionaire owner, but we're here to serve the public good. And we are supposed to be fair and unbiased, in part because we have advertisers who expect us to be that way. So it's been interesting to watch the New York Times pivot to a subscription model versus a digital advertising model, and what that's done with their sort of relationship with their audience and their sort of public relations issues in the last couple of years.
Peter, we have a question from someone in our audience who's asking, and your bosses might not like this, I guess, but they're asking, can you suggest other places aside from your program on Snapchat? Where else on digital media on social media, do you graze for political news and public affairs news generally?
Yeah, I am like a lot of the animals I've been talking about lately. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and I'm unfortunately an early adopter of Twitter, and realized the other day that I've been mainlining Twitter into my brain every day for 12 years now. There are plenty of bad sides to that, which I've articulated. The good sides are I know who's a good reporter and who I can trust and who's not. And I know who's entertaining and who's not, and how to filter that out. And I am a highly engaged journalist with a master's degree in journalism. And a lot of people aren't as literate in how journalism works. And that can be a problem for consumers. I have actually defaulted, Ralph, to having the home delivered Los Angeles Times as my favorite news source lately. And I know this sounds crazy, but the great thing about newspapers is They are so well organized and curated, and you have to have some kind of intent when you open them, so you know you're going to sports, weather, international, what have you. The reason I love the LA Times, I'm biased, I live in LA right now, but it's efficient. It's not just Trump outrage and Trump porn all the time, like the kind of stuff you see on cable news. The writing is not overly dense and labored, and they get to the point. And because I spend so much, my internet experience is so much around politics and then, basketball and music probably, I miss things. And, the sort of serendipitous contact you have with other pieces of news that you get from a newspaper is really wonderful. But on social media, it's really hard. Snapchat, again, is the only place where there's sort of a whole menu of shows that you can choose from, whether you're into sports, fashion, makeup, tutorials, politics, whatever. I've been leaning into podcasts a lot, to be honest. Spotify is a place that I feel like is pretty well searchable for the kind of content you want. They create their own stuff, and I don't know, it just plugs into my life, especially the more I wear these things. I'd say Spotify and Snapchat are probably my two favorite things. And then Twitter is a mess, but if you really care about politics, it's kind of where you need to be.
Okay, so since you mentioned podcasts, and I want to come back to newspaper for just a second because you mentioned the LA Times. Mm-hmm. One of the things about podcasts, and I think there are a lot of political podcasts or politics podcasts. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily mean politically skewed or politically biased podcasts. I mean podcasts where you can get a good fill of political news. But for whatever it's worth, and again, these data are only 2018, a lot of people are not listening to podcasts. I mean, this chart shows you that 45% of Americans have ever in their lives listened to a podcast as of 2018. And mm-hmm. a 25%, 1/4 of Americans who responded to this poll say that they listened to a podcast in the past month. And mm-hmm. an even smaller number, fewer than 20, about 18% said they listened to one in the last week, which means they're more regular listeners of podcasts. That's not to say that podcasts aren't popular. They're much more popular now than they were when I used to listen to them a long time ago when they were first invented. But it's still, I don't think, a mainstream form of news and public affairs information for political junkies or for non-political junkies. Now, you mentioned the LA Times, and you were talking about the New York Times earlier. The Times, one of the other things the Times has done is, in the last 2 years, has developed a podcast that's quite popular called The Daily, and mm-hmm. a video program that's not as popular, and it seems to come on and off the air from time to time. But they're essentially, the New York Times is dabbling in what you and I used to do on television. And they're saying, well, we can do television too. We can do radio. Let's do this. They're discovering that it's not as easy to do, and B, getting the audience is not as easy either, really.
Yeah. And I, by the way, separately, I love when I'm on Twitter during presidential debates, primaries or otherwise, and you see these, couch jockeys complaining about how CNN or CBS are doing the debate, and the amount of work it takes to make even just the lighting look good for all of these podiums is insane. And if anyone wants to come try to do it themselves, like be their guest. It's not easy putting television together and making it look good. But yeah, I saw another stat recently that in 2018, there were 73 million monthly podcast users in the United States. And that number is growing. But that's still like a quarter of the American population.
And they're very scattered, I think.
That's a monthly user number. For example, Snapchat has 228 million daily active users. That's the sort of the metric that digital platforms use. These are monthly users, so maybe you listen to a podcast once a month or whatever. It's still not a lot of people. Podcasts are, again, like Twitter, a thing that preoccupies the media, but is really the domain of sort of educated, college-educated liberals, honestly, who listen to listen to podcasts mostly. It's not only liberal, obviously, but the sort of buzzy podcasts that we all like to talk about are, by people who, like maybe they live in cities and spend a lot of time on subways. it's just not a mainstream platform yet. But I do think it can represent a future of journalism that's really important, because podcasts are portable. You can bend them into our daily lives. The format of a 3,000 word news article with a lead and a nut graph is a format that was developed at a time when people rode horses and buggies. And it's important to think about how audience behaviors change and to bring journalism into those spaces. And podcasts are a really unique success in that space, if you can afford to do it and do it well. There are a lot of podcasts that people just talking and think they have really important opinions. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Someone like Joe Rogan or Ben Shapiro are really successful because their personalities are, for their audience, magnetic. But when you're listening to it or watching it on YouTube, they're just sitting there. But if you look at The Daily, last time I talked to Michael Barbaro, he said they had some like 15, 20 staff. And that includes like an audio mix that's really nice. They use music. They have an overnight production team, I think, in the UK. So he can like record it in the morning when he wakes up and whatever. I don't know the exact details, but there's a lot of work that goes into making a podcast really good. And the way that, it takes a lot of work to make TV look good. So if it's done well, it can be really powerful.
Okay, Peter, we only have a few minutes left. Mm-hmm. I do want to show one thing related to newspapers for just a second. Let's bring that slide back up for just a second. And when we don't need to dwell on this, because you mentioned the LA Times and the putting the muscular effort into doing journalism and so on. Here's what's happened to the newspaper industry in the last decade or so. And here's what's going on with digital employees in the last decade or so. And, mm-hmm. Definitely a shift toward digital employees, no question about it, but more than 30,000 jobs lost in the newspaper industry. And that's mm-hmm. especially significant in the local markets. It's not as dramatic at the national level as it is at the local level. And it's at the local level where governors are elected and members of Congress are elected and senators are elected and school boards are elected and so on. And increasingly, as a result of this trend away from print media, we're seeing a very dramatic decline in quality local journalism that isn't being filled, at least not significantly yet, I think it's fair to say, by digital media. Comment on that briefly, and then we just have like 2 minutes left, so I want to ask you for predictions too. So
yeah, totally. No, I think one thing to keep in mind for people watching that chart, people talk about the hallowed American industries of steel workers and coal miners. There's actually been more journalism job losses over the last 20 years than there have in steel and coal, but they are not sort of celebrated in politics in the same way, and that's really unfortunate. I think it's beyond the death, or unfortunately, of local news and what that means for local accountability journalism. Journalists themselves used to come up through these places like, Anniston, Alabama, or Tampa, or San Antonio, and then move up the national ladder of media. And because of that, you had some perspective of what life was like for people in another part of the country. Today, you can go to Yale and then get a job at BuzzFeed and then get a job at the New York Times. And like, that's, maybe I'm generalizing, but that's a pretty narrow field of view to then all of a sudden be covering national politics in a digital newsroom. So, when I started doing this and I would travel, I'd be on campaign buses with reporters from local newspapers in various swing states, and that just doesn't happen anymore. A lot of the media is just owned and operated in Washington and New York, and it's not a surprise then that sometimes they have pretty big blind spots about what's happening in this country.
All right, Peter, in just the last couple of minutes here, I'm just going to ask you to, maybe offer some predictions, and I don't know whether you like to do that or not. What are we, and I'm not asking you to predict who's going to win the election or whatever, but give us a couple, 3, 5 things that you think we should watch for over the next couple, 3 months before the election.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people on the internet are worried that Democrats are too overconfident, that, what about 2016? We all thought Hillary was going to win. Joe Biden is winning the presidential race now by 15 points. 80% of the country thinks that the United States is, quote, out of control. Vast majorities in every poll say the country is on the wrong track. Joe Biden is winning independents by 21 points. Trump won that cohort in 2016 by 8. All signs point to an actual bloodbath, and it is not a mark of just overconfidence or media prediction to say that. It shouldn't be surprising or controversial, but I think 2016 was such an existential, like it screwed with us existentially in so many ways in the media that people are afraid to make predictions, and I don't want to predict. But right now, every indicator in the polls suggests that Joe Biden's going to win. Texas and Georgia are now swing states. The Trump campaign is spending tens of millions of dollars in Ohio. Like these are why we can safely assume that Joe Biden is in the driver's seat. And then that's obviously going to have an impact down ballot. For anyone who's covered politics in the United States, going back to 2017, every single election has favored the Democrats. And that's a political environment that Donald Trump himself has created. He is on the ballot, beyond coronavirus, beyond the protests, beyond anything. This election is about Donald Trump. Joe Biden could pick. I happen to think the vice presidential pick doesn't even matter that much. It won't move the needle either way. People have made their decision. So, play this back for me in 5 months and mock me if you will, but it's just hard to see how Trump suddenly swings suburban independents who favor Biden by 20 points back into his camp at this point. So that's my half measure prediction at the moment.
Okay, Peter, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but we're over time, but we're going to go over time just a little bit here because we've got
Sure.
a couple more questions from people in our audience that I think are good questions, and you're uniquely capable of responding to them. I'm going to give them to you both at the same time, and then you can answer them as you wish. Jennifer is asking us whether you can give some tricks to identify good reporters. How would viewers, particularly on social media, be able to spot a shill or to spot a phony and to spot someone who's got good journalism chops that they should pay attention to? And I think a related question from Michelle is, how do digital platforms like yours build their reputations so they become as respected in the political and public affairs arena as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times you mentioned, et cetera? Take a couple minutes to respond to those.
Yeah. So on the first question, that's so hard. If you came into Twitter cold, you would have no idea who to follow. There are so many hucksters and grifters on the internet who just want attention. This is a little bit of a stalkery probably behavior, but if there's a reporter you like and you trust, just see who they follow on Twitter. Dave Weigel is a really good example at the Washington Post. He's a reporter who literally except for right now, spends most of his life on airplanes and in rental cars covering politics all over the country. And, Jonathan Martin at the New York Times is really wonderful. Maggie Haberman at the New York Times is great. There's so many reporters out there. See who they're following. A lot of times they're following other journalists. That's a good gateway into figuring out who's good and who's not. Or I've been listening to the 538 Politics podcast a lot, which is very dorky because it's a lot of numbers crunching. But I like those guys, and I just follow them on Twitter, and then I see who they retweet and follow. So, you just work backwards from the platforms you're already following and reading and listening to, and then see what their behaviors are like online. The other question is a great question. I mean, a lot of people Snapchat, for example, don't understand what we do. When I book guests on my show this year, I interviewed Anthony Fauci, I interviewed Joe Biden. They and their staffs understand the unique reach of the platform among young people, and so they're more willing to do it. But you have to mount a case. It's just not a known brand in terms of news and politics as those other publications you mentioned are. But I would also say they're not distinctive things. People come onto Snapchat to read the Wall Street Journal, to read the New York Times in the same way you would do that on Facebook or Twitter or any platform. Those brands exist there. Part of it is just generational. I mean, whatever platform you use, you are more likely to trust it. I think a lot of Snapchat users probably love Snapchat and open it every day, but would be caught dead on Facebook and don't understand why anyone would use Facebook, right? You live where your own social networks and your friends are. So I would say we are trusted among people who use Snapchat every day. It's the people who don't, use it, which is largely people over the age of 40 who don't quite get what it is.
All right. Peter, it's been a fantastic pleasure to talk with you again. Thank you so much for coming on the program. Peter Hamby, the head of news for Snapchat and the host of Snapchat's popular political documentary called Good Luck America. Thank you for being with us. On behalf of Spur Impact and the Delaware Millennial Summit, thank you for joining us for our series called Your Vote, Your Vision. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Good night.